I Am a Legend Tonight, Love Gun, 1976, 1977. When it came time to go back into the studio to make our next album, we had to decide whether to work with Bob Ezrin again. Ace and Peter were pressing us to get back to basics, to being a four-piece rock and roll band without arrangements, ballads, or someone else telling us how to play. At the time, a certain segment of our fan base felt that Destroyer was a very plush record. If you listen to it today, it's one of our most consistent rock records, and it probably stands the test of time as well as any. But they were violins, so for some people, that was a problem. Change is always difficult for the hard and heavy. So Ace and Peter wanted to get back to doing straight-ahead rock and roll, and we were sensitive to that. We rented out the Star Theater, a theater in upstate New York that Frank Sinatra actually had a stake in. Later on, it went out of business mysteriously after a fire. There was a center stage and seats all around it. We brought in Eddie Kramer and started work on the next album, Rock and Roll Over. We recorded the songs that Paul and I had written on tour. Ace and Peter also submitted songs, most of which were, at least in our estimation, not up to par. The ones that survived wound up being on the record, but rearranged and rewritten. There were plenty of things that Paul and I did without taking credit for, because we knew that the fans prefer to think that everybody in the band wrote and was as creative as everybody else. It was a relatively stable time for the band. We were fairly happy. Still, talking about stability in Kiss is like talking about freedom in a prison. It's all relative. Ace and Peter continued to do the most bizarre things. Ace had a fascination with Nazi memorabilia, and in his drunken stupors, he and his best friend would make videotapes of themselves dressed up as Nazis. At the time, the mayor of New York was Ed Koch, who was Jewish, and Ace showed me a piece of tape where he and his best friend were making verbal threats against the Jew in New York, saying, "We'll cook him up." Of course, he was drunk out of his mind. Paul and I weren't thrilled about that, but Ace laughed at how funny he was when he saw the tape. Peter, too, was drinking heavily and using drugs. At one point, he went into a club and allegedly demanded that a certain substance be put in front of him in a bowl. The owner of the club refused, so Peter tried to intimidate him, but nothing happened. Again, he was all bark and no bite. This was how he liked to do business, with intimidation and bluster. Despite all this hassle, Paul and I stayed loyal to the band. No matter what the lunacy was, the band was together. In retrospect, it might have been a mistake. We would have saved ourselves a ton of headaches if, at the first sign of trouble, we had made changes in the band. Throughout this time, Ace and Peter were begging us to do exactly that. Later, when Ace made his solo album, he went on record and said that if he hadn't left the band, he would have killed himself, because he said he wasn't allowed creative freedom within Kiss. But once he left the band, he went bankrupt, filed Chapter 11, and became a bigger drug addict than he ever had been, I'm sorry to say. Ace, God bless him, has told me he believes in extraterrestrials, ghosts, karma, and other bizarre things. He has a lucky number, which is 27. If he gets change from a cashier and he's got 2 pennies and a quarter, he'll stare at them until you ask him what he's doing, and then he'll say, "Look, if you add up these coins, they become 27. Or if you're in a restaurant and the prices of the specials are on the board, he'll add up those numbers to figure out what to order. If a number there interferes with his lucky number theory, he'll just discount it. At one point I told him, "Ace, I think you better pick another lucky number. You haven't been so lucky." But he doesn't understand. He's the kind of guy who will come back from Las Vegas and tell you about how much money he's won without saying a word about how much he's lost. Fame creates monsters, and I'm not just talking about Ace and Peter. I'm also talking about myself. At around this time in 1977, we hired a new road manager, Frankie Scanlaro. He was on the shorter side and round, and we loved him. He missed his calling in life because he constantly kept all of us laughing. Frankie had been through the rock wars with other bands. He had heard all the drug and booze stories, and he was wise to Ace and Peter. He was also wise to Gene and Paul. He gave all of us nicknames. Once he got to know us, these names reached right down to the core of who we were and what each of our personal agendas was. One of Peter's nicknames, for example, was Peter Long, because he was always complaining. He was also called the Ayatollah Chris Cola and Mr. Misery. Ace was high octane because he was frequently tanked. Paul was the he-she because of his androgynous appeal. I was Gene the Nazarene. Frankie thought, rightfully so, that I had an inflated sense of myself and that I thought everyone else was an idiot. He would often say, "Oh, thank you so much for talking to me. I feel so honored. I want to grow up to be exactly like you." He kept bowing to me and scraping. It was humiliating, but I deserved it. In the mid-'70s, we were popular enough that teenagers and even younger kids were buying our records, and that meant lots of other Kiss products were in demand. Halloween masks, lunchboxes, stickers for school notebooks, pencil erasers. Moving forward with the merchandising changed the complexion of the band. It changed the size of the vision, the shape of our projects, everything. And it wasn't greeted with universal support from the band. Ace and Peter didn't like it, because they didn't see the big picture, and even Paul was a little reluctant. Some things he saw as improper in a rock and roll context. Paul often would, and still does, shoot down ideas because he's more cautious. He tries to contain what we've got. Though I'm supposed to pick up the phone at all times and discuss new ideas with him, I often don't. I just plow straight ahead and do it. Whether it's Kiss My Ass toilet paper, or Kisstory books, or whatever, and later on, Paul and I have words with each other. They're never fatal disputes, though. They're spirited disagreements. I would sit up and do drawings. In fact, I came in with an idea called Kiss World in 1976 that I had our lawyers trademark. I wanted 10 flatbed trucks with everything inside them, designed so that when they pulled up to the state fair, the walls of the trucks would open up and flatten out so that all the trucks connected to each other. There would be stairs, and in the middle a big tent, and all of a sudden you would have a facility. You wouldn't have to rent out a venue. Instead, you would go to an open field where you would sponsor Kiss wet T-shirt contests, run concert film, host Kiss tribute bands, and most important, sell Kiss merchandise. I had it all designed, but the band decided not to do it. It was too big, they said, and too commercial. To this day, I stand by it. Initially, everybody thought these ideas were cheesy, but now, no matter who you are, you remember your first Kiss lunchbox. Many people still have theirs. Every once in a while, I would see a band that I knew was going to be big. Van Halen was one of them. I saw them in a club, the Starwood, in 1977. I went with Bebe Buell, a model who was friendly with a number of rock stars. She's perhaps better known today as the mother of the actress Liv Tyler. Bebe and I were going to see a band called The Boys, and opening was a new band called Van Halen. Within 2 songs, I knew they were going to be huge. Strangely, they did only okay at the club. People liked them, but it wasn't a maniacal response. But I knew. I went backstage, went over to them, and introduced myself. I went right into business mode. I wanted to know their plans. They had a potential backer who was a yogurt manufacturer. I said, "Please do me a favor, don't do that. I'll fly you to New York. I'll produce your demo." I signed them to a contract. Immediately, I started to bring them around. In Los Angeles, we went into Village Recorders, and in New York City, I bought David Lee Roth some leather pants and belts and platform shoes. Then I produced their demo at Electric Lady Studios, 13 to 15 songs, most of which wound up on the first and second albums. Some of those were my arrangements. The next step was to try to convince Bill Aucoin and the rest of Kiss to sign them. But the rest of the guys in the band were angry that I was turning my attention to other acts, and Bill Aucoin thought Roth looked too much like Black Oak, Arkansas. He didn't get it. I told Eddie Van Halen and the others that even though they were signed to me, I would try again after Kiss toured. Within 2 or 3 months, Van Halen got interest from Warner Brothers. I said, "You go for it. I'll tear up the contract. Just go." Though this was the first time I got interested in a younger band, it was by no means the last. I would have plenty of other opportunities to work with groups, starting their careers, or to help remake the careers of older artists. Working with bands other than Kiss was liberating in some respects, because I could share everything I had learned about the record business. And often, naivete about the business is what does young bands in. Kiss had conquered America. We had conquered Europe, and then in early '77, we went to Japan to play a series of sold-out shows at Budokan in Tokyo. We learned later that we had broken the Beatles' record there. We didn't know anything about Japan. When we landed there, we did the same thing that we did in England, which was to walk off the plane in full makeup and outfits in case there were any reporters. Well, that was a great plan, except that the Japanese customs officials didn't let us into the country because they didn't believe that we were the same people as those pictured on our passports. So we had to take the makeup off, pass through, and then put it back on before we went outside. When we finally emerged from the airport, there were about 5,000 Japanese fans outside. The Japanese promoter, Mr. Udo, had arranged to have duplicate cars, and most of the fans ran after the duplicates while we snuck out the back and jumped into other cars. But enough of the fans figured it out and came after us. I really thought we were going to die. There were just so many people crushing us. They were on top of the cars. They could physically lift up the car. It was major Kiss mania, like what you see in the Beatles' A Hard Day's Night, but bigger, because the cars were being rocked and rolled, and it wasn't just girls, but guys as well. We later learned that the Japanese fans felt a great kinship with us because of our makeup, which looked like kabuki theater makeup, but also like the Japanese superhero shows. In the same way that some of our early American fans were black because they didn't see us as either white or black, the Japanese took to us because they didn't see us as American or Asian. The girls in Japan were also wonderful, very willing, and very available. The interesting thing about Japanese women, in my experience, is that they have a little girl quality, a certain innocence about their sexuality. Coquette is a French word, and that concept just doesn't exist in Japan, at least as far as I saw. For instance, when Japanese girls orgasm, a peculiar sound emanates from them that almost sounds like a baby crying. Japan wasn't just another country. It was more like another world. Within the country, we traveled by the bullet train, the fastest train in the world. The Japanese fans, and especially the girls, would follow us everywhere we went. They would giggle, give us presents, and break into hysterical crying fits in front of us. Peter brought Lydia, his wife, with him on the Japanese tour, so outside of work, we didn't see much of him. Ace, on the other hand, was full of piss and vinegar. One night he knocked on my door and appeared in front of me drunk out of his mind, in full Nazi uniform with his friend, saluting and yelling into my face, "Heil Hitler!" I have pictures. Ace knew how I felt about Nazi Germany. He knew that my mother had been in the concentration camps and that her whole family had been wiped out, but that didn't stop him. Many years later, during the 2001 Kiss farewell tour in Japan, drummer Eric Singer, who had taken over for Peter Criss at the time, jokingly started calling Ace Race Fraley. During one of our off days in Japan, the band went to a nightclub where we were met by a gentleman who introduced himself as Gon. He was stout and powerful and could clearly take care of himself. We didn't speak Japanese, so we relied on our translators. We went over to our VIP section, and within seconds, girls started to line up and pass by us and giggle. The man next to me was of some importance, I could tell, because when he put a cigarette up to his mouth, 2 other men nearby immediately lit it for him. We exchanged pleasantries. I learned later that he might be from the Yakuza, the Japanese mob. One of the girls in the crowd reached out, and we shook hands. Gon broke off the contact, spit in her face, and raged at her in Japanese. She cried and ran off. The translator explained that Gon was merely doing what he thought was proper. He was there to protect us, and she was not worthy of touching me. This was clearly a completely different culture. At one point, I got up to go to the dance floor, and security men followed me. Most of the Japanese are smaller than Americans. A Japanese girl might be 5'2". One of the girls, a beauty about 5'8", made eye contact with me. I immediately went over and took her hand and pulled her toward the dance floor. She smiled. I told her I wanted to go back to the hotel, but the music was too loud. All she did was keep smiling. We got inside the hotel, and I tried conversation, and then it dawned on me that she couldn't speak a word of English. It didn't seem to matter, though. We didn't need to talk. The next day, one of our security guards told me she was a famous Japanese television star. Right before commercial breaks late at night, Japanese television would show a shot of a beautiful, naked girl smiling into the camera. When we got back to America, our press office showed me a press clipping from Japan. There she was, smiling her smile in front of countless members of the Japanese press. The translator explained that the title of the article was My Night of Passion with Gene Simmons. I didn't mind. I was actually quite flattered. She was gorgeous. Even though Love Gun, which was released in 1977, was our 3rd album in a row to ship 1 million copies, the band came apart at the seams during that time. It wasn't that we were breaking up, but people were starting to need their own space again. We had been together for 5 years, which is coming up on the typical lifespan of a band. I always had the sense that the Beatles were around forever. But when you look at the number of years, it's astonishing how brief they were. Only a decade of existence, and only 7 years of recording from Meet the Beatles to Let It Be. The strain was pulling us apart, but it was also pushing us forward into new projects and uncharted waters. From the beginning, I had been heavily indebted to comic books, and in 1978, we made good on that relationship by getting a comic book of our own. First, a Marvel artist named Steve Gerber, who was a big fan, put us in the last 2 issues of Howard the Duck. We were demons who possessed Howard. Marvel noticed that those 2 Howard the Duck issues soared in sales even though we weren't on the cover, so they approached us about a Kiss comic book. Someone arranged for me to meet Stan Lee, the head of Marvel. He was a god to me. As a kid, I had sent a letter to Marvel critiquing something, and I actually got a postcard back signed by Stan Lee saying, "Never give up." It was signed Stan, and I thought, that's it. I've made it. Marvel Comics were so important to me because heroes like Spider-Man had these screwed-up lives that contrasted with their superhero lives. Superman, which was a DC comic, was a classic concept, but I didn't read Superman as loyally. He wasn't a teenager. He didn't have problems. When Stan Lee and I met, I told him his real name was Stanley Lieber, and that Larry Lieber, one of the inkers at Marvel, was his brother, and that Cadence Industries owned Marvel. I knew his secretary's name, which was Flo Steinberg. He was floored. We talked and found that we were kindred spirits. He had changed his name because he didn't want people to know he was Jewish, as had I. The wings on my outfit were influenced by a character called Black Bolt that Stan Lee had created. As the Kiss comic book project moved along, someone came up with the idea of putting real blood in the ink. It wasn't me. Maybe it was Bill or Sean. We got into a DC-3, one of those big prop planes, and flew up to Buffalo to Marvel's printing plant. where they pour the ink and make comic books. A notary public actually witnessed the blood being drawn. The comic book, which was published in 1978, became Marvel's biggest-selling comic book. At around this time, we decided to do another live album, a collection of material from Destroyer, Rock and Roll Over, and Love Gun. We did it partly at the insistence of the record company and partly to repay our fans for their loyal support. The first live album had helped to define our career, and a second would be a kind of bookend. In some ways, we were crazy to even try. Since 1977 was such an incredibly busy year, the Japanese tour took up most of March, Love Gun was released in June, and then Alive 2 followed in November. But we weren't ready to go into the studio. We were squabbling over material, and even if we had been ready, it would have taken time to get into the studio. Because we didn't want fans to feel cheated, we wrote new songs for one side of Alive 2. When we finally went into the studio, Ace simply never showed up. We had to use other guitar players like Bob Kulick and Rick Derringer. Ace was more furious than ever. "How could you do it without me?" he raged. How could we? Because these other guys showed up. This wasn't the first, nor would it be the last of countless times Ace would turn his back on the band. Regardless, even without Ace, Alive 2 went on to be another multi-platinum double-disc set. Midway through 1978, Hanna-Barbera, the famous cartoon producers, approached us about being in a movie. We had already been in Howard the Duck and in the Marvel comic book. We had an initial meeting and they told us about the idea, and we shrugged our shoulders and said, "Sounds fine." The movie was shot at an amusement park called Magic Mountain, which had the biggest roller coaster in the world. We were literally never on a soundstage. The entire story took place in the park. The story was, a mad scientist was terrorizing visitors to this haunted amusement park. Kiss helped to unmask the scientist and solve the mystery. The director of the movie was Gordon Hessler, a director of action and suspense movies. He was actually very sweet about it. He would do a shot and ask us how things went. What did we know? They basically shot around us because we were the stars. We took 2 hours to put our makeup on. By that time, Ace and Peter were miserable. Kiss was on the covers of all the magazines, but it was often a solo shot only of me. Sometimes Paul got a cover, but it was hardly ever Ace, and it was never Peter. This wasn't anything I planned. The press picks up on whoever they pick up on. Ace and Peter thought I arranged and connived to keep them off the covers. They still had their chance. We had 2 writers with us who were writing the script for Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park, and they wanted to get a sense of how everybody talked before they wrote the script. Ace in those days was non-communicative. He didn't say much. No matter what you said to him, he would make the parrot sound, "Awk!" Nobody understood it, and when he wasn't making the parrot noise, he would mumble nonsense to himself. 13 for a dozen, or "I kills them all, one by one," and then he would laugh. These phrases meant something only to Ace, and nobody had a clue what he was talking about. When the script came in, Ace's character never spoke. He only said, "Awk." Ace was furious. He wanted to know why they didn't give him any lines. To their credit, they turned around and said, "What are you, nuts? You have never said anything to us except awk. We thought that's the way you want to talk." Ace said he had a lot to say. Well, he should have said it. When we did Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park, the rest of the band was incensed, because the newspaper ads usually showed a much larger photo of me. If they showed any other figure, they were all in the background, and my face was 4 times the size of everybody else's. Paul and I have always had a kind of brotherly competitive thing, and we had quite a bit of back and forth over the years. Paul would get slightly angry because he perceived that I was dominating the band too much, or vice versa. But the ads for the movie, and particularly those in TV Guide, really bothered Ace and Peter. They felt they weren't as involved in the film as Paul and I were. We didn't really have a choice. First of all, Peter had been involved in yet another car accident. He skidded 400 feet before he crashed, and he wound up in the hospital. When he did speak in the movie, he was impossible to understand because of his thick Brooklyn accent, so his voice was dubbed by someone else. Even the simple matter of getting Peter and Ace in front of the camera didn't always work out. Sometimes they went missing. They just didn't come to the set. The only solution was to use doubles. For Peter, we had a 55-year-old guy, and we put makeup on him. For Ace, an African-American stunt double. Making the movie wasn't smooth, it wasn't easy, and it wasn't particularly fun. But like almost everything else we did then, it was a success. Kiss Meets the Phantom was eventually shown on NBC at Halloween. Because the television ratings were so strong, AFCO Embassy released it theatrically outside the United States. When we toured Canada, I saw it at a movie theater. When we toured Australia, I saw it at a drive-in. That was very bizarre, because I had grown up worshiping Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, and here we were running through a freak movie meeting Frankenstein and Dracula. The problems kept surfacing, though. Most of them originated with Ace, who kept shooting himself in the foot, and Peter kept following right along. At one point, Ace started saying, "That's it, I'm leaving. I'm going to do my own solo record." So Bill Aucoin said, "Look, don't leave the band. Let's all do solo records. Maybe what we need is time away from each other." Everybody agreed. Then She Kissed Me, Life with Cher, 1978. The first time I met Cher, it was 1978 at a party Neil Bogart was throwing for Casablanca. I didn't really know any of the other people there. I knew some by face and by reputation, but not personally. At some point in the evening, I found myself talking to Cher. I introduced myself, and she didn't believe that I was who I said I was. It turned out that her daughter, Chastity, was a Kiss fan and had encouraged her mother to go to the party because she knew Gene Simmons would be there. But Cher apparently had it in her mind that she would be meeting Gene Simmons, the movie actress. She didn't make the connection. At that time, I was starting to think of ideas for my solo album, which I envisioned as a big production, with tons of guest stars and a circus atmosphere. I thought it would be great if I could get Cher to sing on the record. At the end of the night, I went over to her place. In the limo with us was Welcome Back Kotter's Marcia Strassman, who warned Cher about my wandering eyes. Normally, this would have meant one thing, and one thing only, but in this case it meant something else entirely. We were back at her place, and before I knew it, we were talking about our lives, about where we had come from, about what we were like as children. All of a sudden, I started to feel the presence of another person in the conversation. This was a strange feeling for me. She was smart, interesting, and funny. At that moment, at least, I set aside the thought of it turning into anything sexual. The night went on, and Cher made some hot chocolate for the two of us, and we kept talking about things, her life, my record. I remember the hot chocolate because she put marshmallows in it, which I had never seen done. She seemed interested in the fact that even though I was a rock and roller, I could put a sentence together, and also in the fact that I was straight and had never been drunk. Cher had just come out of a relationship with Greg Allman, who had a reported serious substance abuse problem. Cher herself was always anti-drug. Early the next morning, 5 or 6 a.m., she drove me back to l'Hermitage Hotel, where I was staying. We parted and agreed to talk more about my solo record. I felt there was something brewing. Meanwhile, I wanted to see if she was interested in going out that evening. She said she was going to see the Tubes, the rock band, in concert. "Great," I said. "What time do you want me to pick you up?" She explained that she had already invited her friend Kate Jackson, who was in Charlie's Angels at the time. I didn't know Kate, but it was fine with me. We ate dinner, the three of us, and then afterward headed over to see the Tubes. Usually at a concert like this, I would arrive with the audience and leave with the audience, but this was different. When we went backstage, it was very awkward. Some of the tubes were taken with Cher, so I sat in the corner and talked with Kate Jackson. Finally, the backstage party was over, and we got in the car to go home. On the way back, you could have heard a pin drop, and back in the house when Cher finally spoke, she exploded. She told me that she didn't take very kindly to being ignored, especially when I was coming on to her girlfriend, Kate. I was speechless. When I tried to talk to Cher about it, she told me that she never wanted to see me again. In retrospect, I realized I should have been more aware, but I was oblivious to that kind of thing because I hadn't had any real relationships and because the whole jealousy thing was foreign to me. I wasn't accustomed to having conversations about how somebody else felt. I'm an only child. My mother came from incredible hardship. She was in the concentration camps, the worst tragedy of the 20th century. I grew up relatively poor. I was happy if I had something to eat. For me, that was the beginning and the end of everything. If I wanted companionship, I'd get companionship. If I was tired, I went to sleep. Life was good, simple, and straightforward. Still, at first with Cher, it was neither simple nor straightforward. I called her from the hotel and said that I was going to New York to work on a record and that I would call her when I got there. "Fine," she said. "I can't talk to you now." On my way to New York and after I arrived, I was still thinking about her. There were other girls in my life, of course, girls I had seen before and would see after, but Cher was on my mind a tremendous amount. During the day I kept calling her under the pretense that I wanted her to sing on my record. We would speak for hours on end, and I found her fascinating. Our conversations usually got personal pretty fast, though. Early in our relationship, she had me talking about this situation with Kate and how she was angry that I had given attention to another woman. This seemed fair to me. It made sense. It was reasonable. And most of all, it was compelling to me. There I was in New York with plenty of other women. My old life was back, except that it wasn't back at all. Part of me was thousands of miles away, with Cher. One night, while I was in the company of a beautiful young woman, the phone rang. It was Cher. And before I knew it, we were talking again. She wanted to know when I was coming back to California. She wanted to know when we could sit down and talk about the record. So then we started talking about us again, about Cher's feelings, about what she wanted from me. It was a strange situation, made stranger by the fact that there was this beautiful girl in the other room waiting for me. I liked this girl, but there was something about the woman on the other end of the phone, this woman I hadn't been sexual with yet, that I couldn't ignore. In New York, we were working on a new greatest hits album, double platinum, and specifically on a new disco version of Strutter. This was Neil Bogart's idea. He wanted to mix his two biggest properties, which were Kiss and disco. It was pretty much the same song except for the drum track, which was added on later. I didn't care for the version and didn't really have much to do with it. At any rate, right when we finished recording the new version, I told the other guys that I had to leave. I was going out to California to see what was happening with the Cher situation. If you had known me at any time before that, you would have been sure that the guy standing in front of you in the studio was an imposter, leaving without putting the final touches on a song and flying off to see a girl just wasn't something I did. But I was new to this relationship thing. Cher met me at the Los Angeles airport in jeans and a t-shirt. At the time, that was still one of the major differences between the coasts. California had already gone casual. It was all about dressing natural and looking natural. In New York, if you had money, you showed it on your back, silk shirts, leather pants, all those kinds of things. No one wore jeans and t-shirts except for bums. New York was the Dolls. L.A. was the Doobie Brothers. From the airport, we took a limousine back to her place. I must have expected things to accelerate immediately, must have expected there to be some activity in the car. But she threw me a curve. There was no sex in the car, just cuddling and holding hands. There was just this kind of giddy sensation that wasn't like anything I'd ever experienced before. When we got back to her house, it was more of the same. Hot chocolate, giggling. I had my suitcase with me, and for all intents and purposes, and before I knew it, I moved in right then. Within the Kiss world, the fact that I had gone to California was causing some ripples of discontent. For starters, Ace and Peter didn't like it. They thought it meant they were a secondary priority, that something else was more important to me, and they felt threatened by it. Interestingly, some of the fans felt the same way. It was similar in some regard to what happened with the early British bands. Managers routinely suppressed information about the band members' steady girlfriends, and in some cases even wives, because those realities didn't harmonize with the way fans wanted to see their pop idols. This situation was roughly equivalent. Kiss fans wanted to see us as hard-working, tough-living New York musicians, reviled by critics, aggressively outside the rock establishment. The idea that one of us was living in California with a huge pop star, a huge television star, wasn't immediately accepted. The one person who understood my situation, even though at first he didn't approve, was Paul. He had gotten a taste of California over the years. Whenever we had stopped there to record or tour, and when I went out west to live with Cher, he started to see Cher's sister, Georgianne. They got along so well that I thought they were going to get married. It didn't happen, but it wasn't because Paul was against marriage in principle. He had always wanted to get married, always wanted to have a monogamous relationship and children. Life with Cher was a real adjustment. To start with, I had a whole new group of friends, actually. That's not quite accurate. They were more like acquaintances, mostly people Cher was close to, from Dolly Parton to Kate Jackson to Jane Fonda. At first I felt quite awkward about that situation because the idea of celebrities hanging out with celebrities always struck me as a bit odd. Slowly, though, I got more comfortable. The fact that they were actors and not musicians helped. For one thing, actors could put a sentence together. That's a huge difference. That's their business. They communicate and look you in the eye, and they were able to appear in public without being seen as freaks. Being in Kiss, by contrast, didn't prepare us for the social world. We didn't have very good people skills because we were so sheltered. Nobody even knew what we looked like without makeup, and we hardly ever saw people except in hotel rooms because we were always hiding from the paparazzi. Still, when I first arrived in California, I was walking around on shaky legs. With groupies, I didn't have to explain who and what I was. Suddenly, I'm going around with Cher and being somewhat of a father to Chastity and Elijah, going on walks, having conversations. I remember once Cher woke me up early in the morning. We had moved to her Malibu home. I said, "What? What?" It must have been 6 in the morning. "Let's go running," she said. "Where to?" I put on my leather pants and silk shirt and snakeskin boots. "You can't dress like that," she said. "Why not?" "Well, you've got to put on these sneakers and shorts because we're going to go run on the beach." "Why?" I said. I was dumbfounded. I mean, you didn't do that in New York, not in 1978. Jog was not even a word I knew. In New York, it was always too cold to run. And where were you going to run, anyway? It was something you did when somebody was chasing you. So we went. There I was, running alongside Cher in my snakeskin boots, and I could barely stand up because my boots were sinking into the sand. And out on the beach suddenly, I saw Neil Diamond and then Barbra Streisand. It was like I was on another planet. The bizarre thing about it is, they didn't act the way you thought they were going to act. They were just regular people. On the other hand, Kiss fans may be struck similarly when they meet me. You know, I'm the guy that spits blood and then it's, "Hello, nice to meet you." They're thinking, "Wait a minute, how come he didn't drool blood?" I met Jane Fonda through Cher. Our interaction was brief. I was in the studio, and she came over to have dinner with me. In person, she was more attractive than in her photographs or movies. She was bright and didn't chit-chat very much. She seemed interested in the whole Kiss thing and kept asking questions about it. She also asked my opinion about a movie she'd been working on and what I thought about the title, The China Syndrome. She told me what it was about. I told her I didn't think much of the title. I said I preferred something like, "What if, ... The 3 dots following the if would light up one at a time and start to cycle faster and faster with a beep being heard for each visual flash. The movie came out. It was called The China Syndrome. After a little while in California, I got distracted a bit from the rock and roll world. Even though I had always loved movies and wanted to explore that field, I was still a guy in a band. I didn't have a clue how to get into it, who the studio executives were, or what the structure was. But I started to get immersed in that world, mostly through Cher, who wasn't yet a movie star but was trying to break into film. She had her TV show, first with Sonny and then on her own. And she had done huge shows in Las Vegas. She was at that point probably the biggest star in the country, or certainly one who could be counted on to sell magazines. When we went to parties, I watched how people interacted with each other. I noticed how Cher was to certain people, very cordial, even though afterward she would tell me that she didn't know who the person was. I thought that was bizarre, because in my experience, within the confines of a band, if someone came up to me and said, "Hi, it's so nice to see you again," I would say honestly and straightforwardly, "I'm sorry, I don't remember ever meeting you. Who are you?" It took me a while to get accustomed to Los Angeles, not just because of the surreal fact of all these celebrities milling around, treating each other like ordinary people, but because there were new rules. The same kind of thing that had happened after the Tubes concert happened again and again. We had conversations about her feelings, about how she wasn't sure how she felt, and so on. It was like a foreign language to me. I had never watched soap operas, partly because I never understood what everybody was so miserable about. In those shows, everybody was good-looking, everybody was rich, everybody was healthy and young, and everybody was miserable. The promiscuous characters were berated and tortured for being alive and for not curtailing their natural lusts. The others were talking about their innermost emotions and needs and priorities, and eventually everyone became promiscuous. It seemed absurd in every way. And then all of a sudden, here it was in my own life, Cher telling me, "Here's how I feel, and here's what it means," and asking me, "What did you mean by that? And how do you feel?" I had absolutely no expertise in communicating on that level. The first question I kept thinking of, over and over again, was, why are we even talking about this? If you want to be with me, you are, and if you don't want to be with me, you're not. It's simple. Nothing you have to verbalize. I was being related to in a different way, for the first time in my life. Mostly the girls I'd met didn't have a lot of conversational skills, or they weren't really interested in flexing those muscles. They were just excited to be there with me, whether we were backstage or in a hotel room. Granted, I'd see some of them more than once, but by and large, our relationships were purely sexual. With Cher, though, I had met somebody who could hold her own in a conversation, who had her own feelings and her own points of view about everything. For example, Cher had her own opinions about the women I had been with. I wouldn't say that she was jealous, not exactly. I was a rock star and had been a rock star for quite some time, with a reputation for chasing skirt. As I've said, it was the only thing I could do on the road, since I didn't drink or take drugs. The thing that threw Cher a little bit was the photography. Since 1976 or so, I had been taking pictures of the girls I had been with, sometimes film footage. I didn't do it without their knowledge or compliance. In fact, most of the girls were thrilled about it. It was a hobby of mine, partly to keep things exciting and partly as a kind of documentary. There were so many girls. By the time I met Cher, somewhere in the neighborhood of a few thousand. At one point, I told Cher about the photographs. It wasn't to confess, because I didn't feel guilty. I just wanted to share everything with her. She was shocked. She didn't understand why I would want to do that. As far as I was concerned, it wasn't any stranger than any other road behaviors, drinking, drugs, and that kind of thing. In fact, it was quite a bit less strange, and it didn't hurt anyone. Politics also came up often, although it was celebrity-style politics. Once I remember in a room with a bunch of other people, friends of Cher's, and we were watching television commercials with footage of poor African children. People got sadder and sadder, and finally someone said, "That's it, I'm adopting that child." Then another one chimed in, "Yeah, me too." It was almost like the home shopping network of kids. I didn't know what to make of it. At the core of it was an admirable impulse. You want to do something good for somebody. And these people weren't holding press conferences and saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, I just gave to charity." But it was strange to think that this was how people were finding out about the world, that they became aware of the existence of the poor because they were pictured on the television set. And it's strange that they decided to help out by picking up the phone and making a pledge. There were lots of things like that in California. Therapy, for example, was something that had never appealed to me. Paul was big into therapy, and he used to tell me that my attitudes towards women and my reluctance to commit to a marriage would eventually create a huge conflict in my psyche, and then my world would crack, and I would have to go into analysis to figure out why I was doing what I was doing. Again, I thought this was bizarre. I was doing something I enjoyed, and it wasn't hurting me. It made life worth living, and I liked it. Ironically, much later, Paul's therapist actually ended up working for Kiss in a completely different capacity, a business capacity, and then he flipped out in front of me and Paul. So much for therapy. California was also awash in Est, and in meditation, and in Eastern mysticism. I didn't have much use for any of them. Even when the Beatles were going through their Maharishi phase, I felt betrayed. You idiots, I thought. While India may be a spiritually brilliant country, spirituality meant nothing to me. Children are dying there every day of starvation. I'd rather be unspiritual and fed than spiritual and starving. Sorry. This was always my philosophy. Pragmatism. Let other people go into trances and think about spirituality or Werner Erhard. I'd rather concentrate on having something to eat, the here and the now. Be glad you can get a good night's sleep and eat a good meal, and if you're lucky enough, have somebody attractive sharing your bed with you. That's about all there is to life. People magazine did a couple of cover stories about Cher's and my relationship, and though I was used to the idea that photographers tried to capture me without my Kiss makeup, this kicked it up tremendously. We were constantly hounded by paparazzi, night and day. I started covering my face with handkerchiefs like a bandit. I liked how Cher dealt with the other men who had been in her life, particularly Sonny Bono. I liked Sonny a lot. With Sonny and Cher, it was up and down. They were comfortable enough with each other, but they had their issues, she told me. They had been married and things hadn't worked out. That's always complicated. Still, on one or two occasions we'd go shopping together. Sonny and his then-wife Susie, and Cher and myself. When I told him what a big fan of his songwriting I was, he was shocked that I knew the history of what he had done, his production work with Phil Spector, that he had written The Beat Goes On, I Got You Babe, and many more songs. Most of the time my life with Cher was great. Everything was hilarious. Everything was funny. I'd run down the street with her on my back. It was like we were two young kids. Once we went into a Westwood store, and Cher and her sister Georgianne decided to walk down the street for a second. I said, "I'll just look around the bookstore." I was wearing Samoans and very short shorts for the first time, standard issue California dress. And I saw a couple pointing toward me, and I'm going, "Yeah, what are you looking at?" "Okay, so I'm in Kiss, and I'm dressed this way, and I'm browsing in a bookstore." Big deal. It's a New York thing. You're confrontational. So they turned around and walked away. When I walked over to Cher, I told her about it. "Can you imagine those people are staring at me? So what? So I'm in Kiss." "They weren't looking at you. Your balls are hanging out from your shorts." I looked down, and sure enough they were. They might as well have had a neon sign around them. Likewise, when I took Cher to the Tavern on the Green in New York City, and we were having dinner, I saw flash bulbs going off at my back. "Look," I said to Cher, "this is so rude. I'll take care of it." "No, it's okay," she said. "I'm used to this." "It's my job," I said. I was insistent. "I'm the man. I'll take care of this." I got up and walked over to this Midwestern family, maybe 8 of them, with Mom and Dad and the kids. He had his camera up, and I pointed at it and went into a long speech. Sir, don't you realize just because you're from Oshkosh and we're in New York? Okay, so Cher and I, okay, so I'm in Kiss and I'm the guy with the long tongue. I'm like, there is no reason why you have to take photos of us because it's embarrassing. I mean, how would you like it if I took photos of you? And he's going, what are you talking about? I'm just taking photos of my family. Our life together had comedy far more often than tragedy. Once we had an argument about something, but I don't argue. There is no argument with me. I don't even remember what it was about. But it was something that made Cher angry. I said, look, it's not worth it. I'll see you later. And I packed up my trunk and moved to Westwood. She then came in the Jeep with Chastity and said, okay, we won't argue. Come on back. There's nothing worth fighting about except health and money, and the rest is okay. By and large, I had a monogamous relationship. By and large. Monogamy is not an issue for me. If somebody who's with me decides she wants to have a liaison, she will anyway, so I might as well just relax about it. And if you're going to break up, you're going to break up. The idea of owning somebody has never been part of it for me. I want to know that you're with me because you want to be, not because you have to be. If you have to be with somebody, then you become like every other wife and husband. You torture each other. There's the classic joke, why do husbands die younger than their wives? Because they want to. I don't want to do that. Every day has got to be fun. Hey, if we're not having fun together, whether you've been with 10 sailors or I've been with 10 nurses, if we're not enjoying it, why don't we just split and stop torturing each other? If we can't be lovers, why can't we at least be friends? Cher brought out my playful side. On her birthday, she awoke to the sound of a plane circling right above the Beverly Hills Hotel, where we were staying. It seemed dangerously close to us. When we ran out, she could clearly see a plane pulling a sign wishing her a happy birthday. I had gotten special clearance from the airport to fly in circles above the hotel. Later, she heard singing outside the bungalow. She opened the door to the sight of 34 college students, the Azusa Citrus Choir, singing beautiful songs. Later still, a full marching band came marching right into the bungalow, through and around us, and then 2 little people knocked on the door, presented Cher with frozen Snickers, her favorites, and escorted us out the door to a waiting tank, which took us down Sunset Boulevard to the Le Dome restaurant. Cars gave us the right of way when they saw the tank's gun turret in their rear-view mirrors. At the restaurant, I had a virtual Fellini Satyricon full of people, guys on stilts, magicians, and belly dancers. All of Cher's friends were there, and the night was a huge success, until the belly dancers started to dance suggestively in front of me. At that point, Cher became furious and stormed out. Her former manager stopped her and talked sense into her, and we drove back to the hotel together in silence. Again, this was all new to me. I was standing on shaky emotional ground. I didn't really know what I was feeling. On one side, I felt that nothing had happened, and on the other, I felt indignant. Why should I have to feel guilty about anything? When we got back to the hotel, I had bought a giant television set, the best of its day, and had rented a soft porn film. I had never watched one, and in retrospect, I was only trying to make myself more interesting to Cher. We didn't watch it. Once Cher bought a little black dog, and I named him Louie. I loved him. As a little boy, I had a dog who was everything to me. I never had many friends, and being an only child, I poured my love into my first dog. My mother worked all day, and all I had was that dog. He used to lick my face. At one point, I became very ill, and my father blamed it on the dog. He took the dog into the city and let him go. I was heartbroken and never forgot him. When I set eyes on Louie, it was almost as if that first dog, that childhood dog, had finally come back home. I know it sounds melodramatic. The demon who throws up blood on stage cries when a little black dog looks at him. Go figure. When Cher and I were back in New York, the relationship continued. She came over to my mom's house in Queens, and all my uncles and cousins were there. She was as sweet as could be, and Elijah Blue, her son by Greg Allman, was very small at the time. At one point, he climbed onto one of my cousin's laps and spit right in her face. He didn't know what he was doing. He was just a baby. In one way, it was shocking, but it was also hilarious. With Cher in New York, I was introduced to an entire other world to which I'd never thought I belonged. I went to Halston's house, and anybody who was anybody was there, from Andy Warhol to Liza Minnelli. The few conversations I had focused mainly on the fact that I was a curiosity, the guy who sticks his tongue out and spits fire. At these events, people would always be disappearing into bathrooms. I never understood what that was about. I was that naive about drugs, even at that late date, and the conversations weren't particularly interesting for me because I wasn't very interested in other people's lifestyles, even for the length of a brief conversation. Did you hear that so-and-so just bought a new house? Someone would say, and that they were thinking of designing it with a Mediterranean but not a Southern Californian accent. To me it was chit-chat. I've always been about the facts. Give me the information, and then it's off to the pleasure zones. But sitting around playing mahjong and sipping tea is such an empty idea to me. I just don't understand. Whiling away the hours is a bore. As a result, when I met other celebrities, I wasn't too interested. Many of them were great, though. Steve Rubell always treated me terrifically. Warhol was always very cordial. "I like your art," he would say. I always thought that was a strange notion because coming from a guy who made a Campbell soup can into pop art, I guess I understand it. All in all, the pretentiousness of the scene seemed silly to me. I always thought art should be the name of a guy, and then the rest of it should be up to the people. I believe in the American ideal, of the people, by the people, for the people. You get to do stuff, whether it's a painting or a book, and then it's up to us, the people, to decide if it's art, not the person who creates it. So the idea of some artist saying, "I am an artist," seems a bit full of oneself. I'd like to think that you wouldn't have the right to say that unless the people agreed. I've always believed in the great unwashed masses. Still, however idyllic life with Cher was, I had to get back to work. Since Ace had broached the subject of solo albums during the filming of Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park, I had my own solo album on my mind. I had begun working on new songs. In Kiss, we all worked differently. Usually, I would walk in and present the band with anywhere from 20 to 30 new songs. Out of my batch, we would whittle them down to 4 or 6 for an album. Peter would get a songwriting credit when and if someone brought in a song, mostly finished, and he contributed a part. Ace, on the rare occasion he actually got up to work, might come in with a few songs. Paul would usually wait until the last minute, but somehow he would always come up with the goods. I wanted my solo album to be the greatest show on earth, with choirs and tons of special guest stars. My initial vision included everyone from Lassie to Jerry Lee Lewis to Lennon, who was still alive then, and McCartney. These weren't all possible, of course. Jerry Lee Lewis couldn't make it as a result of a scheduling conflict. Lassie, too, had a scheduling conflict. As for Lennon and McCartney, I called up their management and made an offer for them to appear on the album. When they said no, I hired 2 guys from Beatlemania, the Beatles tribute stage show, to do the singing. I didn't replace Jerry Lee and Lassie, but the final record included many, many guest appearances. Early on, I took over Cherokee Studios in Los Angeles and called on musicians from other bands to come and help me do the demos of new songs. Joe Perry from Aerosmith came down and played a killer solo on one of the new songs. Katie Segal, who I saw for a short time around the same time I was seeing Cher, and 2 other girls from the group with no name, sang on a few others. I excitedly played Cher the new songs I'd been working on, but usually a blank stare came over her face. She never really understood our music. While I was telling her about my new songs, she would be telling me about her dreams to remake The Enchanted Cottage, a movie she loved. We were both dreamers. As I went on with a solo project, I wanted to pursue my Beatles obsession, so I rented a recording studio in Oxford, England, down the road from where George Harrison lived. Anytime I wanted another star to appear on the record, I flew them in and treated them like royalty. I tried to make a point, a showy point granted, that I was capable of playing guitar, so on the album I didn't play bass at all. I only played guitar. Cher and Chastity appeared on one song called Living in Sin at the Holiday Inn. Sean Delaney produced my solo record, and he brought in Michael Kamen to arrange and conduct about 30 of the finest string players in Los Angeles. One morning they had arrived and were seated inside the recording studio, ready to do their parts on a song I'd written called Man of a Thousand Faces. Sean had arranged to have them all wear Gene Simmons face masks, the ones that were for sale in stores. It was certainly one of the most bizarre moments in my life, to open the door and see a room full of violin players all looking like me. On another occasion, I had Janice Ian at the studio at the same time Grace Slick came down to record with me. I had met Grace on tour because she was seeing our lighting director and would visit him on the road. Janice, Sean, and I were discussing some ideas when suddenly all hell broke loose. Grace had apparently ingested some chemical that didn't agree with her constitution. She flipped out, and studio staff helped her out of the studio. Other pairings were just as exciting. Helen Reddy came down to sing on a song called True Confessions. I had ping-pong tables set up inside the recording studio, and Helen and I played ping-pong. Donna Summer did me the favor of singing with me on Burning Up with Fever. She blew the roof right off. We got along well. By that time, she'd become our record company's next big thing. Kiss was the first act to sign with Casablanca, and Donna was up and coming at the label. And Bob Seger, another hard-driving rock and roll vocalist, sang with me on Radioactive, which became the single off the record. We had known Bob for many years. Earlier, he had opened for us on tour. At one of the shows, while Seeger and his band were getting ready to go on stage, I stood alongside Alto Reed, his horn sax guy. Alto mentioned that he needed something to drink. He said his mouth was dry. I offered him a piece of gum, which he said he would start chewing right away. That night was a strange one for the Seeger show. You see, at that point in my life, I loved pranks and would often buy whoopee cushions and the like. I also bought onion gum, which looks like gum and tastes like gum initially, until about the 10th chew, when a hard onion taste explodes in your mouth. The solo project was unprecedented. No other group in history had ever released 4 solo albums simultaneously. Even though the solo albums were a way for Ace and Peter to feel they had a bit more creative control, we were intent on controlling the project. Both our management and our record company, Casablanca, released all 4 solo records on the same day in 1978. Insisted that each album have the same kind of artwork. We all used the same artist, Eraldo Carugati, so the entire project felt like a coordinated band solo release, something that has never been done before or since. All the albums did well. They sold strong initially and have continued to perform. After 20-plus years of sales figures, I'm at the top, slightly ahead of Ace, who is slightly ahead of Paul. Peters sold the least well of the 4. None of the albums really yielded hits. The song that got the farthest was Ace's cover of a song called New York Groove, which went to number 14. Peter didn't chart. Radioactive, my single, stopped in the 20s, and Paul's Hold Me, Touch Me was a little lower than that. The solo album was a big boost for Ace. For the first time, he was thrilled because he could walk into a room and be the only star, the guy who had his own thing going on, his own album with his own face on the cover. The irony was that when he first joined the band, he didn't want to sing or write songs. He just wanted to be the guitar player. We had forced him to start writing songs. Once he found out he could do it, he actually delivered the goods. He was able to put out an album that in a lot of ways was probably the most cohesive of the four. The solo albums sold about 1 million each, but Casablanca was accustomed to having 2 albums a year from us as a band, and they didn't count the solo ones. So just after that, Neil Bogart put out a greatest hits record, double platinum. I had to go back to New York and start getting ready for the next Kiss tour, and I wanted Cher and the kids to come live with me. I went to FAO Schwartz and bought a 6-foot-long bed shaped like a sneaker for Chastity. They all came with a nanny, and when Cher saw my condo, she said it wasn't big enough and moved into the Pierre Hotel. It soon became clear that if I wanted Cher to be with me in New York, I would have to finally buy a home that would suit her, so I went shopping for a larger place. Cher and I were refused at the Dakota, where John Lennon lived. We were deemed to be too much trouble, because the press was on our tail night and day. I finally found a space I thought she would like, the top floor of the former Heart Fund building, on the corner of 5th Avenue and 64th Street, across from the Children's Zoo at Central Park. There was nothing on the top floor then, so I bought air rights, which meant that I could build a dwelling on the entire top floor of the existing building. I hired Cher's architect from California and flew him to New York. While the penthouse was being built, Kiss went out on tour. When we came back home, I took the elevator up to the penthouse. It opened up into my floor. There were Romanesque columns and a giant bathtub in the middle of the larger bedroom, with marble all over the place. It was a showpiece. Cher loved it, and so did I. The problem was that by the time it was finished, Cher and I had stopped being lovers and went back to being friends. The headaches with the other 2 guys in the band continued. Peter was depressed, Ace was as infuriating as ever, and both of them were increasingly being controlled by substances. Ace's behavior was probably more interesting, although no less maddening. Ace has always struck me as never living up to his potential. He could play guitar, write songs, and do any number of other things, but he's never applied himself. He's admitted to being chronically lazy and a flake. He can put an idea together that has a spark of brilliance, but he won't go that extra mile to get trademarks and copyrights. You can see hundreds of guitar straps today, for example, with big lightning bolt designs on them, straps that are used by everyone from country acts to rap bands. That's Ace's design. He walked in one day with this strap, and I said, "That's great. Let's trademark that. It'll sell like hotcakes." I had a heart-to-heart talk with him. He just wouldn't do it. After the fact, I said, "You really missed out on a big one." He said, "I'll think of another one." He never did. With these kinds of headaches in the band, there were plenty of times I would have preferred to stay with Cher. But whenever I sat down and thought seriously about things, I realized that at least at that point I would never risk breaking the band up or leaving. It was all-inclusive and invasive. So in one way I sort of forgot that I had any options. I gave myself completely to the band and defined myself that way. I was Gene Simmons from Kiss. From Kiss might as well have been my last name. Soon enough, the 4 of us were in contact again. We didn't tour in back of the solo albums. We were talking about meeting in New York to record a new album. This one we decided to call Dynasty. Dirty Living, Dynasty and Unmasked, 1979-1980. Dynasty was recorded in New York City with Vinnie Poncia, who had been Peter's producer for his solo album. Paul and I had met with Vinnie at Bill Aucoin's suggestion, in part to show Peter that we thought well of his record and to bring him back into the fold. By that time, Peter was our biggest liability because he had become dependent on chemicals. Ironically, Vinnie decided that even though he produced Peter's record, he didn't think Peter was good enough to drum on a Kiss record. Peter was not qualified to make any judgments about material or arrangements, he said. In Vinnie Poncia's estimation, Peter was close to tone-deaf and didn't play drums very well. At times I have reassessed my criticisms of Ace and Peter. Sometimes I have to remind myself that everybody has their cross to bear. If I were Ace or Peter, I would find Gene Simmons very difficult to take. I've never been high, except in a dentist's chair and that one incident with the brownies. And I don't have much use for small talk. Whenever I spoke to Ace and Peter, it was to get information: who, what, why, when, where, and how. They just didn't deal well with that. We would have numerous meetings before a tour or recording session, and they just couldn't sit still. They'd be cracking jokes and throwing food at each other, and every time at the end of the meeting they would ask me, "What was that about? What were you saying?" Or a day later they would ask, "Okay, when are we going to talk about the album?" And I would have to explain that we had talked about it, and that they had agreed to certain terms. Nothing would stick. Ace and Peter didn't take notes, didn't read memos. It was a bull in the china shop situation. They would come into a room not knowing where anything was, and figured that whatever was going to happen was going to happen. This was always a problem, but in 1979 the stakes were much higher. By that time, Kiss was a big, fat, bloated beast. We each had our own security guard. Culturally, the band reached its peak around 1979. We topped the Gallup poll as top rock band 3 years in a row, from 1977 to 1979. Number 2 was the Beatles, then the Bee Gees, then Led Zeppelin. We were so much a part of the cultural landscape, so much a part of what people thought of when they thought about rock and roll, it was hard to imagine being any bigger. The bodyguards served us all in different ways. I liked it because I could get twice as many phone numbers from girls, and they were certainly handy during a concert when I would say, 14, 3, which meant, after the show, bring me the girl in the 14th seat, 3rd row. For me, it was all about skirt chasing. I didn't need them as actual security. I'm 6'2". For the Dynasty Tour 1979, I wanted to make up with bombast what we had clearly started lacking in musical precision. We made the stage much bigger with the design Paul brought in. We had elevator lifts that brought us up from under the stage, which everyone from Michael Jackson to John Bon Jovi to Garth Brooks would do later. We also had a lighting system that looked like it came out of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It could move up and down. The drums levitated higher than they ever had. We even had the front of the stage disconnect and lift the band over the heads of the people in the front rows. To up the stakes even more, I got the bright idea of having a rig built to fly me up to the light system, 55 feet above the ground. Every night, I would throw up the blood that had been hidden in my mouth during the previous blackout, stand there erect and proud, and wait for the audience to give me my due. I would demand it. And although at that point I felt powerful, the feeling would quickly dissipate as I was flying straight up through the air at 6 feet a second. I was scared stiff every night, and I kept thinking to myself every time I flew up there in the dark, what an idiot I was to have got myself into this mess. My relationship with Cher had changed my romantic life. It made me reconsider some of the basic things I'd assumed about women. It also changed my financial life. In some ways, I guess, it forced me to grow up. Before Cher, I'd never lived with anyone. Even in 1979, when we were on top of the world, I was paying $200 a month rent in New York City, and that was my full exposure financially. I didn't have a car, I didn't know how to drive, and didn't want to learn. I was completely happy and was amassing a nice fortune because I wasn't spending any money. I hardly ever went shopping and had no real girlfriends to throw money at. Every once in a while, I'd splurge and ask Tavern on the Green to send food up to my apartment. But that was it. While I was with Cher, though, I got used to spending more money. In fact, all of us had more expenses, whether they were real expenses like families or girlfriends, or childish expenses like cars. So for creative and financial reasons alike, we needed a hit. By the time of the Dynasty recording sessions, Paul was specifically trying to write a hit single, and he did. He came up with one with a guy named Desmond Child. Paul's song, I Was Made for Loving You, dovetailed nicely with what Casablanca wanted. They were hinting more strongly than ever that they wanted to have a single from Kiss. Paul embraced this idea, and I fought it slightly. Although not out of any sense of grand principle, I would sit down and try to work with Vinnie Poncia, who had come from a different school of thought, but who I liked. He had produced Ringo Starr, and he was a pop singles guy. I Was Made for Loving You had a certain driving force and a catchy melody. I didn't really see it. Paul knew it was a hit song, but it was Vinnie Poncia who pushed for us to record it. At the same time, the whole band was being pulled apart. The biggest problem was Peter, who was by this point becoming unhealthy, in part because of the chemicals, and certainly because he wasn't allowed to play drums. We had always been able to placate him before, but this time, under even more pressure, he became harder to control. We hadn't been away very long, only a year really, and fans had gotten plenty of music in that stretch. Alive 2, double platinum, and all 4 solo albums, all of them selling platinum. But the record label was accustomed to having 2 Kiss records each and every year because of the blistering pace that we had set through the mid-1970s. As we got ready to finish Dynasty, Bill Aucoin alerted us to the idea of a Return of Kiss campaign and told us that we were going in for a cover shoot with Scavullo, the big fashion photographer. He put us in straitjackets. We got the photos done, and they looked great. A few days later, we did a video session for a series of television commercials keyed to the same theme. That session went less smoothly. The director insisted on take after take, and the day was getting longer. Peter was especially unhappy with the way it was going, so he ran into the bathroom and started to complain. Bill Aucoin tried to calm Peter down. Peter then got so upset, either with himself or with the way things were going, and I assume that the chemicals in his system had something to do with it, that he took his fist and smashed it into a glass case so hard that a shard went right through his hand. He had to be taken to a hospital and stitched up. Now there was a question whether there was even going to be a tour, whether Peter's damaged tendons would allow him to use his right hand at all. We were horrified. Our initial thought right away was for Peter's safety, because we lived with him and cared about him, no matter the consistent torture he put us through. But afterward, when the shock of the accident wore off, Paul and I got angry. Oh my God, we would say, what an idiot. Can you imagine being so upset at anything that you drive your fist through a glass case? The whole James Dean lifestyle had never appealed to me, because after that guy dies in a car crash, I'm going to sleep with his girlfriend. Dynasty was released, and immediately I Was Made for Loving You went to the top of the charts. It was huge, the biggest single we'd ever had worldwide. To this day, it is one of the only 2 gold singles released by Kiss. The other one is Beth. And when you have a hit single, you also have a pressure to follow it up with more singles and even more aggressive touring. A year before, the 4 of us had been feeling our way through our own lives, getting a little breathing room. Now here we were, right back in the thick of things. The tour was huge, and both Ace and Peter were so miserable they turned on each other and for a moment actually swung at each other. They both cried and fell into each other's arms afterward. It was 1980, time for another album. Once we started working on Unmasked, it became clear that Peter's chemical problems had become major and that he needed some serious help. But he couldn't get that help within the context of the band. There was too much temptation, too many distractions, and he was causing all of us too much stress. We had a discussion with Vinnie Poncia, and he said, look, I don't want to use Peter on Unmasked. I want to use Anton Fig. Anton, who later became the drummer for David Letterman's late night band, was a friend of Ace's, and he had appeared on Ace's solo album. He was also in a band called Spider that was managed by Bill Aucoin. Using Anton instead of Peter played into Ace's hands, because it made him feel more in control. This was the kind of balancing act that Paul and I were used to. 1 year making Peter feel better about himself, the next year doing the same thing for Ace. The decision to use a different drummer on the album was just the first step in dealing with Peter. We honestly weren't sure what to do with him. He had been with the band since we started, and Kiss was an extremely loyal organization. Toward the end of the recording sessions, Poncia asked him to come in and add some harmonies on selected songs. They didn't go very well either. After the album came out, we were getting ready to go out on tour, and Bill Aucoin came by to talk. "Look," he said, "you guys have a tour to do. I don't want to get another drummer. Give Peter another chance." Peter had talked with Bill and Ace, and they agreed that he needed another chance. He wanted to come in and show how different he was. So we set up a meeting at SIR Rehearsal Studios in New York, and at the appointed time Peter appeared, carrying a music stand, the kind that symphony orchestra players have, with a clip for the sheet music. He looked very serious and intense. Peter couldn't read or write music, not then and not now. None of us could. We were a self-taught rock band. But by that time he was so delusional that he thought if he had a music stand, he could convince us that he had changed. I'm surprised he didn't bring a baton. "You guys," he said, "I've completely changed my life around. I've been studying drums and music for the past 6 months, and I can read music. I'm completely better." I looked at the music sheets incredulously, and then at him. "Can you read and write music, Peter?" "Sure," he said, then mumbled something, but I couldn't make head or tail of it. Then we started playing, and he was worse than ever. So we had a meeting afterwards, and we said, "Peter is unhealthy. He's going to kill himself. He's got to leave the band and get some help." So after much deliberation, everybody, including Ace, voted him out of the band. To the press, we used the traditional rock and roll excuses: creative differences, desire to begin a solo career, and so on. We never said that Peter was thrown out of the band because he was a drug addict. We wouldn't have done that to him, to the fans, or to ourselves. By 1981, my relationship with Cher had changed. We were still seeing each other, but we had moved on. Even though its shape had shifted, the relationship had changed me permanently. Up through my late 20s, I had been dead set against anything and anyone getting in my way. As much as I loved women, the idea of a relationship struck me as impossibly confining. When you have a serious girlfriend or a wife, life is full of commands. Sit, stay, roll over. I didn't want to learn new tricks. I wanted to grow up to be an old dog and lift my leg and pee anywhere I chose. I thought I knew myself well enough to say that I would never give in, or be in a relationship that limited my happiness, or never have children. I wanted to be completely selfish because in some ways I wanted to be fair and not start something I wouldn't finish. A lot of men get in relationships, have children, and then walk out, like my father. I didn't want to become my father. Then came the relationship with Cher, and it hit me like a truck. I was so taken off guard that I started doing everything I thought I wouldn't normally do. I wore shorts, I pulled my hair back. I allowed myself to be happy in simpler ways, with simpler things. When Cher and I decided to change things, there was no pain or anguish because neither of us had tortured the other. From what I've seen, so many relationships are based on intense extremes of love or hate. The first phase is all about love and devotion, this feeling that you would do anything for the other person. Then things go wrong, and couples become venomously vengeful, and anything and everything is fair game. That wasn't the way Cher and I were, ever. When it began to end, I remind myself how wonderful she was and how lucky I had been to have known her, and prepared to go back to my whoring ways. The last thing I expected was to meet another woman and start another serious relationship. It was Christmas time, and I had to return to New York from California to audition new drummers to replace Peter. I was talking to Cher, because we were still close, and she asked me to get her a Christmas present. "I don't know what to buy you for Christmas," I said. "Go and talk to my friend Diana. She'll show you what I like. We shop at the same places." This was Diana Ross, who had begun her career with the Supremes, become not only Motown's biggest star, but one of the biggest stars in the world, and then had gone on to an immensely successful solo career, both in music and in movies. She was more than a singer. She was an icon. When I came into New York, I tracked down Diana on the phone, and she invited me over to her place. I remember coming in and immediately thinking two things about her. First, that she was very sensual, and second, that she was in firm control of her career. At that point, she was taking steps to leave Motown, and she seemed to know a lot about her career. I sat there and we talked. She wanted to know how Kiss worked, since our success didn't rely on hit singles. I tried to explain our philosophy of playing concerts and creating a fan base that was founded on loyalty, not on hit singles. This was the polar opposite to the kind of career Diana had built. But I could tell that it interested her and she wanted to understand it better. While we were talking, she made coffee and then she offered me a piece of chocolate cake. This isn't a euphemism. I inhaled it so quickly that she offered me a second piece, and that went away too. Over the next few weeks, Diana and I became friends. We talked, and I took her to dinner a few times. We even played racquetball. I was a pretty good player, and Diana had never played before, so we spent most of our time on the floor of the court laughing about how fast the ball was going. We didn't think much of it, and I'm not sure that either of us had any hidden agenda, but pretty quickly it became apparent something was happening between us. Diana was a strong woman, and there wasn't any real pressure on me to be the centerpiece of her life. I admired how she conducted her personal life. She'd been married to Bob Silverstein, and I was struck by the fact that she was still close to him. He was a good guy and we got along. Being with Diana was a combination of joys. That is, I'd like to think everyone's hope that a relationship can exist on more than sexual energy, like the ability to sit and actually like being with each other. Diana and I would talk about lots of things. I confided in her early on how I was scared of having kids and that I thought I would never get married. She seemed to know something I didn't, but never preached to me. She clearly loved her children, and I would like to think wanted the same joy for me, but she never pushed the idea that I should become a father. In the back of my mind, perhaps to justify my fear of commitment, was the notion that men don't seem to go through their lives agonizing over when it's time to have children. We don't have a biological clock. If we have any kind of clock, it probably goes off within a day or two if we don't have some kind of companionship. Women, on the other hand, are reminded of wanting children all the time, culturally and I think biologically. Being in Kiss afforded me the opportunity of an inexhaustible supply of beautiful girls who simply wanted to be with me, perhaps only because I was in Kiss. And the only thing they wanted was what I wanted too. Society's rules didn't apply in my hotel room, or on the bus, or wherever I would have liaisons. In another environment, a girl might first want to get to know a prospective suitor and be taken out to dinner. Inside my bedroom, it was clearly wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. No, what does it all mean sermon, no dinner, just dessert. And they didn't mind sharing. The more the merrier. If I took one of these ladies with me for a week, it would start beautifully, but within a few days it would become clear that lust is one thing, companionship another. I wanted not only to bed a beautiful girl, but I also wanted to talk to her. I wanted her to have something to say back to me, to disagree with me, to give me a run for my money. Well, let's not go that far. If I was in the studio, she would wait for me. If I wanted to go someplace, she would want to go there too. Now, mind you, this sounds like the kind of situation any guy would dream of. But aside from the joys of having some young, lusty girl share my bed, the waking hours tended to grow stale with her. There was a constant pull and tug inside of me. On the one hand, I craved and clearly loved being in bed in the arms of a beauty, but I also loved to cuddle. I always wanted to be with girls, but I didn't want them to want me. Not too much, at least. I had invented myself I had come from another culture and had experienced a totally different reality than others I knew. Once I came to America, I soon discovered the secret of the great melting pot. I had been born in Israel, spoke a guttural language, wore a yarmulke, and was of the chosen persuasion. If I was to get everything I ever wanted out of life, I would have to dress British, think Yiddish. Gene Simmons was my name. I gave myself that name. I wasn't given the name. There are many things in life that we don't have control over. We're born into a race and nationality. We're raised to follow a certain religion. We're raised to speak a certain language. We're given a first and last name by our parents. We don't have any choice in the matter, and then we're expected to marry and have children within our religion and our race. I would have none of it. I would decide how I would live my life, who I would share my bed with, and I damn well couldn't care less what anyone else thought. At the end of my life, I will have done or attempted anything I ever wanted to do. I will have no regrets. I will not think I woulda, coulda, shoulda. Life should be about choices, and only I was going to choose what was right for me. The only problem was that by the time I met and fell for Diana Ross, I had started to like the idea of having children. I didn't admit it to myself, not then, but I remember walking into Diana's home in Connecticut and feeling the love she and her 3 girls shared. I liked being there. It felt safe. I was surrounded by children. I was living with a woman I loved being with night and day. But they weren't my children, and we weren't married. Being with Diana was liberating. She didn't need me to fulfill her life. She was a mother and a superstar. We were together because we wanted to be. I brought Diana and the kids over to my mother's house for Passover dinner. We spent one summer together at Martha's Vineyard. It was the first time I didn't think about work. Not all the time, anyway. The guys in the band thought I was completely insane by now. I was. I was the guy in the band who was constantly on the hunt for skirt. But here I was settling into domestic life for the second time. Just a Boy. A New Member Meets the Elders. 1980-1982. After Unmasked came out in 1980, we started to look for a new drummer. Auditions were held in downtown New York City. Hundreds of people auditioned. Finally, we got in this guy who was a stove cleaner in White Plains, New York, whose name was Paul Caravello. Paul answered one of the ads, and I'll never forget his audition. He came in and he had the biggest head of hair I'd ever seen. He almost looked like a Muppet. And he was shorter than any of us. Peter had been the shortest too, but Paul was even shorter, maybe 5'5". Still, he was great from the start, cute as a button, with a heart of gold. At the end of the audition, he actually got up, thanked us, and said, "Before I leave, can I have your autograph?" It struck us all, even Ace, as being a sweet thing. He wanted this break so badly, in such a pure way. While working as a stove cleaner, he'd been in bands on and off, and was actually a much better drummer than Peter, and sang with good pitch. He was an all-around better thing for Kiss than Peter was at that point. Once he left the audition, we immediately decided he should be in the band. We called him up and offered him the job, and he couldn't believe it. We changed his name from Paul Caravello to Eric Carr, and we even went out and bought him a Porsche so he wouldn't feel substandard. We wanted him to know that he was in the fold, that he was one of us. Bringing Eric into the band the way we did, just before a tour, with very little preparation and tons of enthusiasm, was like living the beginning of our careers all over again. It was an astonishing thing to watch him take on his new role, and to watch ourselves try to integrate him. First, there was the matter of his personality within the band. What was his character going to be? What was his makeup going to be? Was he going to be an elephant or a giraffe? For an ordinary band, his personality might not have been an issue. For Kiss, it was an issue times 10. For a while, we decided that Eric would look like a hawk, but later he came up with a fox persona. We introduced him by playing at the Palladium in New York City to a crowd of about 3,000 people. That was the trial of fire, and he passed with flying colors. Then we went off to Europe, taking Bon Jovi on their first European tour. Everything was brand new for Eric. He was wide-eyed as we started our European tour, and not used to the kind of fame we were experiencing. One night we were in a hotel in England, and he was downstairs in the bar. There were girls there, as always. One of them introduced herself as a photographer for Melody Maker, a British music industry paper. Eric talked to her for a while and gave her the complete new rock star rap. At one point, he asked her if she wanted to come up and take nude pictures of him. She said sure. So they went up, and apparently he had told her, "Look, these pictures are just for you." She said that she understood completely. Eric got into a bathtub nude, holding a champagne glass, with shades on, and this big mop-top head of hair. Apparently they didn't spend the night together. After she took the pictures, she took off. The next day, Eric related the story to us. We doubled over laughing. It was like Trust on the Road 101. "Are you out of your mind?" we said. "This girl is going to print those photos." Eric protested for a second, but then the truth dawned on him. "Oh, my God," he said. "You think she will?" Of course she did. Everywhere we went with Eric, he was just like that. He was never malicious. He worked hard. He showed up on time. He was a complete professional. But there was constant comedy because he was so inexperienced and trusting. At one of the airports in Europe, he showed up in a camouflage outfit with an ammunition belt around him. All the bullets were hollow, but it wasn't immediately apparent, and at any rate, it wasn't the kind of thing you brought to an airport. So, of course, some of the machine gun-toting security guards at the airport took him off to the side. That's how much they didn't trust him. They thought he was wearing a wig because his hair was so big. "What's under there?" they asked. I mean, they really went from top to bottom. He even had an anal inspection. He was protesting all the way. "What are you talking about? I'm from White Plains." While Peter had complained constantly, Eric was more than fun to have around. He was terrific. After Europe, we went to Australia. At that point, we were the biggest thing the Australians had ever seen. 1 in every 14 people in that country had bought a Kiss record. We played multiple dates in soccer stadiums when nobody else had ever played stadiums there. The first band to ever play stadiums anywhere in the world was the Beatles at Shea Stadium. People don't realize that before then, bands just didn't get to be that big. But when we played Down Under, we were on the cover of every newspaper. On one cover, the headline even said, "Kiss Boots." This was the most trivial story imaginable. We had sent out our platform heels to get fixed at a boot store. Well, somehow, the proprietor wound up being on the cover of the newspaper. There were terrorist attacks and wars being fought, but on the cover there was nothing but the band. Kiss Army Invades Australia. We couldn't go anywhere. We were trapped at the top floor of our hotel. Helicopters with zoom lenses were trying to get photos of us without makeup, because there was a price on our heads. America had gone nuts for Kiss in '74. Japan had taken it to the next level in '77. But Australia in 1981 was like nothing we had ever seen. Anything we wanted was ours. The effect of all this hysteria was that we couldn't go anywhere. This might have been torture, but the Australian promoter, bless him, rented out entire clubs and filled them with girls. They were the top-notch models in the country, and they kept us busy. At these parties, Ace would get blitzed. An Aussie pressman became one of Ace's drinking buddies. And at one of the parties, while everyone was sitting around talking, Ace and the gentleman started making out. I don't really believe that Ace pitched for the other team, but it wouldn't matter if he did. It was clear, however, after he got enough alcohol into his system, all bets were off. He would lose his inhibitions and think nothing of kissing and making out with men. Ace and Peter would think nothing of kissing each other. I think this was an infatuation on both their parts with the Godfather culture that had become very popular with them, a sort of a "we know the right people" attitude, proof that they shared a bond. With Peter being Italian and Ace always threatening to call the right people to do his dirty work if he wasn't treated well. During one of those lavish private parties on the Australian tour, Eric became fascinated by one girl in the club. He was wearing a camouflage outfit again, and everyone else was dressed for nightlife. The guys in leather jackets and frilly shirts, and the girls in very little, except for this one girl, who looked like a female version of Eric, in a woman's camouflage outfit. She was very beautiful, and very shapely, but Eric didn't want to go over, so I arranged for the girl to come over and talk to him, and the two of them really hit it off. He was in the process of convincing her to come back to the hotel, and she kind of laughed and said, "Look, I can't go back with you. I'm married." Eric backed off immediately. I was amazed. "What's the problem?" I said. "If you want her to come, just invite her, and then it's up to her. Whether she's married or not, it's her choice." So he told her where we were going to be next. Melbourne, I think. And wouldn't you know it, she decided to come to see him. She got on a plane and flew to meet us. Most guys would have been thrilled, but Eric was so nervous that by the end of the day, he had horrible gas pains. He had to go to the bathroom every 5 minutes, and it wasn't the kind of gas you could get rid of silently. They were all of the 1812 Overture variety. Needless to say, the girl didn't hang out for long. It was always like that with Eric. Something would always happen to him. On another tour a few years later, when we were on the road in America touring for Creatures of the Night, Eric wrote a long letter in response to a girl who'd written him. Eric was always very emotional, and it wasn't unusual for him to reply to a fan letter with a 5 or 10-page handwritten answer. After he replied to one letter, he ended up having something of a friendship with this girl from Phoenix. When we got to Phoenix on the tour, Eric told me about the girl. He couldn't wait to see her. After our sound check, Eric left, and I noticed a stunning girl in a red dress standing at the back of the empty hall. She had on makeup, perfume, the whole thing. As was my custom, I brought her into my office, which was the backstage bathroom, and threw her on the floor. We had an exchange, shall we say. We became very close friends in a number of positions, and there was a photo session afterward. There always was. Then she happily left. Later that evening, as we were putting on our makeup, I told Eric about my liaison. He wasn't really listening. He was still preoccupied with his Phoenix girl. So we started talking about that, and I happened to ask him how he would know her, since they had never met. Well, he said, "She told me she'd be wearing a red dress." As he was telling me what she looked like, the horror of it dawned on me. I showed him the photos from the afternoon's meet and greet and asked, "Is this her?" Well, he was devastated. I apologized. I told him I didn't know, and that wasn't even the end of it. That night back at the hotel, the two of them met, and he was very upset with her. They fought, and he threw her out. And she came down the hall for a second visit with me. I didn't want Eric to be upset with me, not over this or over anything else. I tried to give him the lay of the land and told him that he couldn't take any of this seriously. For me, it was about fun and games. If you go to a beauty pageant and there are 4 girls there, do you really care who you wind up with? But since it was all so new to him, it really affected him. The Unmasked tour had been a turbulent one for the band. Diana had decided to fly over so we could spend some time together during the first part of the tour when we were in London. It became very difficult even to go to a restaurant. There were paparazzi constantly prowling around, trying to get photos of us together and me without my makeup. To make matters worse, the band and Bill Aucoin had a meeting and decided to confront me about going Hollywood. They said, and rightfully so, that because my relationship with Diana and before that with Cher was so public, it changed the fans' perspective of Kiss. We'd always been outsiders who never fraternized with other celebrities, and now there I was actually having relationships with these women. It just wasn't rock and roll, I was told. All this inner turmoil in the band wasn't helping Ace's mental well-being. Aucoin no longer seemed to have the spark of leadership. Eric was simply happy to be in there and hardly ever voiced an opinion. I was not the favorite guy in the band at the time. After the tour, we retreated to our separate homes and spent time away from each other. I came back to New York to a new dynamic that would unfold before my eyes. Diana and I were not together most of the time, and one day Cher called and told me she'd been offered an acting part in a Broadway play called Come Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean, Jimmy Dean, to be directed by Robert Altman. And could she stay at my place? I said yes, without hesitation. If we were no longer lovers, we were certainly still friends. In hindsight, this was probably unfair to Diana. Although we each had condos on Fifth Avenue, only 5 blocks from each other, I'd be with Diana in the daytime and sometimes keep Cher company at night. She was venturing into a new area in her life as an actress and felt unsure of herself. She needed me, and I was happy to be there for her. Though Diana and Cher had been friends before, it was clear that their friendship could no longer continue. But this too would pass, and Diana and I grew closer. She was recording new material for what would become her first non-Motown record, and Kiss was about to enter the studio to record a kind of record we had never done before, a concept album called The Elder. While Eric was such a positive force, Ace was going deeper and deeper into seclusion. Although he liked Eric very much, he couldn't really hang out with him because Eric wouldn't get high. So, more and more, Ace went off to Las Vegas with his friends and gambled and drank and drove his fast cars too fast. We decided we needed Bob Ezrin back in our lives because he was the guy who had delivered Destroyer, probably our best studio album. We contacted him, and he decided he wanted to work on a new record with us. Bob decided we should move up to Toronto and cut the record there. We started rehearsing in Ace's home studio in Connecticut, but almost immediately there were problems. The first being that Ace had no intention of leaving Connecticut for Toronto. Also, Ezrin made it clear to Ace that his material was not going to wind up on the album, or at least not very much of it, because it wasn't impressing him. And Bob himself was having some substance problems. It was a very unhealthy situation for all of us. And it was unfortunate because this was the first record that Eric Carr was going to play on. Initially, at least, the material for this new album, which ended up being called The Elder, was promising. Eric showed us that he was leagues beyond Peter by teaching himself how to play guitar and co-writing a song I helped him with called Under the Rose. He became a real contributing member of the band, even to the point of dealing with the facts of Kiss life. For example, I had written a song called I, one of whose lines was, "I don't need to get wasted, it only holds me down, 'cause I got a will of my own and the guts to stand alone." The chorus went, "Because I believe in me." That had always been my philosophy. So I decided to write a song about it. I was excited about recording I, but Ezrin didn't feel that Eric's drumming was cutting it on that song, and he brought in a session player. With Peter, that would have resulted in major trauma. Eric, though he wasn't happy about it, dealt with it. The Elder came at a strange time in the band's history. For starters, we were no longer with Casablanca Records. Neil Bogart had been bought out by Polygram, and we went from recording for a label where we had a personal relationship with the president to recording for a large entity called Polygram with an enormous staff. We felt lost. Also, I was starting to knock on Hollywood's doors whenever I was in California. I had some ideas for movies and television shows. One was about a black cowboy called Gabriel who lived just before the Civil War. I came up with the idea that he was the bastard son of a plantation owner who had been forced to join the Union Army as a buffalo soldier. In the end, he has to go down to the South and confront his plantation master, who was his father, but also the man who raped his mother. I thought this might make a good movie, so I took it to Paramount Pictures. When I say I took it to Paramount, I mean that I went to see Sherry Lansing, the head of the studio. I was never the kind of person to wait for managers and agents to arrange a meeting. I told Sherry the Gabriel story, And she said she would think about it. We became friendly. We found out that we'd both taught 6th grade and that we had similar ideas about things. I was attracted to her from the start, but although we went out from time to time, I never did anything about it. From those initial meetings in Hollywood, I came up with the idea for The Elder. I wasn't sure whether it would be a record or a movie. All I knew at first was a line that stuck in my head. When the earth was young, they were already old. I conceived of a race of immortal beings, energy-based beings, a takeoff of Marvel's Watcher. These beings were more observers than participants. They didn't interfere with human choice, and as a result, people were ultimately responsible for their own deeds, good and bad. The more I worked on it, the more I thought this would be a strong movie pitch. When Bob Ezrin read my short story, he said, "Well, this is great. We should do a concept record about your short story." Ezrin made this announcement to the band and said we were going to try to make all of our songs fit around this one central idea. We put all the songs in the pot and got busy rewriting some lyrics, and soon enough, we had a rough storyline. The work went quickly because we knew what we wanted, our own Tommy. This was a first Kiss project where someone, in this case Bob Ezrin, talked the band members into the notion that credibility and respect from critics are as important as the love of the fans. As a result, it was a very serious record for us. It was a bit surprising for Eric, I'm sure. When he first joined, the band was expecting to do a straight rock and roll record, so he was a little caught off guard. He was not necessarily a big fan of the idea. Also, as much as Paul and I trusted Bob's instincts and supported his idea, Ace opposed it. He was completely against it, to the point that he refused to show up, yet again. He wouldn't go up to Toronto and said he would phone in his solo. As it turned out, whenever Ace appears on that record, it's as a result of that process. Copies of the 24-track masters were flown to his home studio in Connecticut from Toronto. At home, he put down a number of different solos, and then it was up to Bob, when it was flown back to Toronto, to figure out which solos to use, or whether, as happened in some cases, another guitar player should be brought in. A number of other guitar players played because Ace just didn't show up. Unfortunately, all the work that went into The Elder seemed to be for nothing. We had a record that, for the first time, bombed so badly it didn't even go gold. We truly were at a crossroads. We had cut our hair, though we still wore makeup. We had a new member in the band, Eric, and we were trying to figure out what to do in the wake of The Elder's disappointing performance. We were not going to tour with a record that didn't sell. So we turned our attention to television and videos. We shot A World Without Heroes, which was co-written by myself, Lou Reed, Paul, and Bob Ezrin, and would later be covered on one of Cher's records. We also shot a video of I, which would have the dubious distinction of charting in the top 10 only in Italy. We did a whirlwind promo tour of Europe and made television appearances. We then went to Mexico City, where Kiss was huge. On the way into the city, the limo was playing one of 4 different radio stations that had Kiss radio programs that did nothing but play Kiss songs and interviews for 4 hours. At the Mexico City Hotel, we were feted by the Mexican record company. We were given gold record awards and hosted the press in full Kiss makeup. Ace took the opportunity to piss into a large bottle and put it next to the other bottles of champagne. But though it was a funny moment, it signaled what was about to happen. When we returned to America, Ace wouldn't return phone calls. We had arranged to be on the Eurovision television show, shown throughout Europe to millions of people. Here was an opportunity to reach a lot of people and perhaps resurrect a dying record. We scheduled a live broadcast feed of us lip-syncing to I from the stage of Studio 54 in New York. When the clock hit 10, we would be on, live. Ace never showed up. We sent limos and George Sewitt, our security guard, to Ace's home. But on returning, he said Ace was close to comatose. The show had to go on. We performed without Ace, and for the first time and last time, as a trio. Polygram decided to release a greatest hits record in Europe only that was to be called Killers. We needed 4 new songs for it, so we got together with a producer named Michael Jackson, whom Paul and I liked very much. He came from a different musical background, but had some good ideas. He had produced Jesse Colin Young from the Youngbloods, one of my favorite bands. On meeting him, I strongly urged him to do something about his name. 2 Michael Jacksons just wouldn't fly. I suggested Michael James Jackson, and he did change it to that. The writing process started. It was clear things would be different. Ace was nowhere to be found. We would deal with that issue when and if we had to, but for now we had work to do. Kiss moved to Los Angeles, where Jackson was based. Paul and Eric rented places, and I moved into Diana's Beverly Hills home. I was completely distracted by Hollywood and movies, and my songwriting as a consequence suffered greatly. The 4 new songs were all written by Paul and co-writers. One of Paul's songs needed a bridge, so I suggested a melody line he didn't care for. I saved the melody and would later reuse it as the centerpiece of a song called I Love It Loud. By 1981, I was spending more and more time in Hollywood. I was approached by Marcy Carsey, a producer of shows like The Cosby Show and Roseanne, to try out for a show to be called Grotus. I would be the star. I shot a short pilot, and everyone seemed to like it enough to get me in front of the ABC staff. There were 10 people around a table, and we chatted for 5 minutes. Then they offered me my own TV series. I was stunned. I went outside with my business guy, who explained the deal to me. I would get $60,000 an episode. He told me if I left Kiss, where I was making substantially more, I would in essence be paying for the privilege of being on television. Aucoin and the band were not happy with me being on TV. This confirmed for them what they told me earlier, that I had gone Hollywood, the worst thing you could do back then. The band was in turmoil. Ace was miserable, Aucoin was slacking, Eric was disillusioned, and Paul felt betrayed by my interest in television. And my fans weren't happy either. The press was having a field day talking about the beast from Kiss, who was dating the Motown diva. The fans turned on me because of it. If I had wanted to live my own life, and if this was the price I had to pay, so be it. But in the end, I didn't do the TV show. I stayed with the band. Killers went out in Europe, and the record company was happy that we were going to make some money for them. At the same time that Killers was being done, we started writing seriously for a new album that we imagined as a heavy record, a big guitar record, to get back to who we were. We knew that Eric was talented enough to be a kind of John Bonham figure, and that in addition he could actually sing. As this heavy record got off the ground, we titled it Creatures of the Night. Michael James Jackson called in a guy from Canada who had had a disco hit. It was Bryan Adams and his partner Jim Vallance, and the 3 of us wrote War Machine and then Rock and Roll Hell. The material was strong. We were excited, the 3 of us. I say the 3 of us because Ace, once again, was nowhere to be found. He refused to come out to California. He never showed up, never played a single note on the record. When we spoke to him, he told us that he was working on his solo material. This was a clear signal that he wanted to leave the band. Still, for some crazy reason, we worked hard to keep him within the band. At one point, Paul drove up to Ace's house to find out what was wrong. Ace launched into a long speech about how he needed a solo career. Paul very reasonably told him he could have both. Ace rejected the idea out of hand, and it became patently obvious that he was going to leave Kiss. In the face of his inevitable departure, we tried to move things along as smoothly as possible. We put his face on the cover and pretended that he played on the album, although he never appeared once. We were concerned that our fans wouldn't be able to deal with the departure of 2 members in 2 records. It would be devastating to them and to their idea of us. The search for a new guitarist started almost immediately. We used 5 or 6 different guitar players on Creatures of the Night, everybody from Rick Derringer to Vinnie Cusano, who would later become Vinnie Vincent and have a temporary place in the band. His performance should have been a shot across the bow for us. It was torture working with him. He didn't like to be told what or how to play. And from the outset, he did things like inviting us out to dinner, and then when the check came, announcing that he had forgotten his wallet. I didn't mind paying, but why would you go and invite me to dinner and then make believe you don't have your wallet? We thought he was wrong for the band. I kept telling him, look, you can't be the guitar player. You're too thin, you're too small, and you just don't look like you're part of the band. And he kept saying, no, I belong. By 1982, things weren't going well between the band and Bill Aucoin either. At the end of the day, the numbers we expected weren't there. Bill, as it turned out, was a terrific idea guy, but he didn't seem to know how to make the best use of the money. When you plan a tour, maybe you don't need 4 security guards for the band. Maybe you just need 2. And if every security guy is getting $1,500 a week, then if you cut out 2 guys, you're saving $3,000 a week for, say, 20 weeks. Every dollar saved could be $1 in our pockets. But these kinds of cost-cutting measures were not really his strong suit. We weren't the only unhappy band on earth. During that time, Eddie Van Halen came down to the studio and played the beginnings of what would become Jump for us. I took him to lunch and he told me how unhappy he was in Van Halen, how David Lee Roth was driving him nuts. He wanted to know whether I would consider taking him into Kiss because he had heard we were looking for a lead guitarist. I didn't think he was serious. We had lunch across from the record plant recording studios, and I listened to him tell me his troubles. Vinnie Vincent was with us. Vinnie at this point was a contributing songwriter and lead guitarist on the Creatures record Only. We thought Kiss with Eddie Van Halen on lead guitar was certainly an exciting idea, but if it came to pass, what would his makeup character be? We thought it better for Kiss to find an unknown and for Eddie to go back to Van Halen. I tried to assure him it would work out. It did, for a time. We eventually caved in and accepted Vinnie. If we had hoped that taking him into the fold might lessen the headaches of dealing with him, those hopes were not fulfilled. First of all, he wanted to hold on to his name, Vinnie Cusano. I told him at the outset that it was not a good idea. It sounded like a fruit vendor, and fairly or unfairly, rock and roll is about image. Everybody else had a nondescript name where you couldn't figure out their ethnicity or anything else about them. I had changed my name, and he would have to do the same. He finally agreed that his name was problematic, but then he had his own ideas about what the new ones should be. He wanted to be called Mick Fury. I didn't have the heart to tell him that he wasn't qualified to do this kind of stuff, and that he should just show up on time and make lots of money. Vinnie worsened. He didn't sign his contract, ever. Finally, we told him he had to sign. It was an offer of employment. He could be in the band or not, but we didn't want to discuss it. It was non-negotiable. And there was a calendar, too. With Creatures done, we either had to lose the window of our tour or go off on tour with this guy. We decided, rightly or wrongly, to go on tour with him. Paul designed Vinnie's Ankh makeup and his Wiz character. All Hell's Breaking Loose, Lick It Up, and my stint as a movie star, 1983, 1984. Kiss was now made up of Eric Carr, Vinnie Vincent, Paul, and me. We liked Creatures of the Night and hoped for the best, but the album did poorly. We booked an American tour, and it was the least successful tour we'd ever done. The music scene was changing. Acts like Michael Jackson were in ascent, and no one showed up to hear us play. In North America, that is. Abroad, especially in South America, we played to the biggest audiences we'd ever played, stadiums full of people, even though the experience was depressing in some respects. It opened our eyes to the idea that no one city and no one marketplace is definitive. If you're not making it in the United States, go to Brazil. If you're not making it in Colombia, try Italy. The biggest change at that time was the rise of MTV. Music was being overtaken by a certain visual style. We'd been a visual band since the beginning, but oddly, our idea of visual panache didn't necessarily translate in the world of early 80s rock and roll, which was dominated by hair metal bands. Hair bands were dominant because they gave younger teenagers, and especially younger girls, access to a kind of rock music that had been considered too dangerous for them before. Girls who were only 13 and 14 were having their first brushes with sexuality, and for their early crushes they were turning to these hair metal bands, to Bon Jovi, to Poison. As it turned out, we had one band member who was perfectly suited for this transition, Paul Stanley. He was at home being that kind of frontman, dancing on the stage. So for the first time in our career, we did exactly what we saw was happening with other bands. It's not worth debating the justification, worrying over originality and inspiration. We were a working band. Instead of being leaders, we decided basically to follow. At around that time, we decided to drop the one visual element that had been associated with Kiss most strongly, and from the very beginning, our makeup. When we started working on Lick It Up, it was a good time musically. We had Michael James Jackson producing once again, and Vinnie Vincent was our guitarist and a contributing songwriter. Vinnie and Paul were particularly successful during this period. The two of them wrote Lick It Up, the title track from that album. In the middle of recording the album, more or less out of nowhere, Paul pulled me aside and said, "Gene, I think it's time to take our makeup off." His reasoning was sound. With all the personnel changes, we had moved farther and farther away from the plausible characters. Vinnie Vincent's character, the Wizard, wasn't sticking with fans the way the Demon or the Star Child had. "Let's prove something to the fans," Paul said. "Let's go and be a real band without makeup." I reluctantly agreed. I didn't know if it was going to work or not, but I heard what Paul was saying. There was nowhere else for us to go. We did a photo session just to see what it would look like. We looked straight into the camera lens. We were defiant. I made one small concession to the fans. I stuck out my tongue to try to keep something that connected us with the past, to remind fans that we weren't a brand new band. We decided to unveil ourselves live on MTV. First, superimposed over our faces, were photos of us in full Kiss makeup. As the VJ announced each of our names, the makeup photos dissolved to our bare faces. We made the best of it, but I was scared stiff. Lick It Up was released and immediately tripled the sales of Creatures of the Night. It went platinum, and we were soon filling up concert halls again. This was clearly a new lease on life. Eric Carr must have felt as if the ground were moving under him every time he took a step. He was thrilled to join the Kiss he knew and loved, but the first record he played on was a concept album. The second was Creatures of the Night. Then, with the third record he played on, Kiss took off the makeup. After we took off our makeup and embraced the MTV age, the crowd changed dramatically. Back in the early days, we had started off with a bizarre crowd, opening for other bands, and Kiss was perceived as a dangerous band of rock metal rebels. When we became more mainstream, the toys and the games brought us a very young crowd. At some point, Mom and Dad would show up with their 3-year-old kids. It became like the circus. The 1980s brought us yet another shift. Suddenly, we were popular with teenage girls. They came to the show. They got in front. They screamed. And sometimes they seemed to want to do more than just scream. Some of them were clearly groupies in training. For the record, I should say that I never went after the underage ones. Enough legal-age girls were showing up. But these young girls would come backstage. They were always around. I would walk into my room, and usually there'd be a girl there. The early and mid-'80s were a troubling time for me in some respects. My connection to Kiss, the dominant part of my life for a decade, began to change. Mainly what happened was that I started to get lost. I didn't know how I was supposed to act, because the no-makeup version of the band was an entirely new idea. Paul was in his prime. He was very comfortable being who he was. Because in some ways, Paul is the same offstage as onstage. For those couple of years, it became more his band. Paul was always the guy who spoke in the interviews. When you saw photos of Kiss, they tended more and more to be photos of Paul. Still, if I stuck my tongue out enough times, I would eventually get in the frame. It's important to be clear about what happened. Paul didn't push me out of the spotlight. He would never do that to me. It's just that his ability to capture the public's attention increased as the music scene changed. My reaction was to try to muscle my way back into the spotlight by buying some truly outlandish, androgynous clothing. It didn't work, not the way I wanted it to. It just made me look like a football player in a tutu. This period also gave me an opportunity to watch Paul at work, and it was an interesting process. Paul's sense of things is what you'd more traditionally think of as the female perspective. Call me simplistic, but I think women are less interested in the end game, in winding up in bed with somebody, than in just being recognized for being attractive. Paul is more like that. Paul is less interested in whether the girl winds up in bed with him than in whether she finds him good-looking. I'm not interested in whether she finds me attractive. I'm only interested in whether she winds up in bed with me. Paul and I both like chocolate cake, so you would think we're alike, but we're completely different. He only likes the frosting. I hate the frosting. I only like the stuff you can chew, the devil's food. So if you walk by a cake and see the devil's food missing, you know I've been there. If you walk by and see the frosting missing, Paul's been there. Between the two of us, we can split a whole cake. So in a very real way, we are opposite pieces of the same puzzle. Somehow it works.